Good morning. Thanks, Lauren. My name is Kevin Murphy, and I have the pleasure of serving as chair of the Elizabeth River Trail Foundation. The ERT Foundation is excited to sponsor this Urban Land Institute Advisory Services panel. This would not be possible without the support of many foundation donors and grant support from the JPB Foundation. We would like to thank the following individuals for their expertise and assistance preparing for the panel. The ULI subcommittee members comprised of Mel Price, Liz Chesley, Brian Townsend, Cheryl White, our executive director, and the ERT's master planning committee. ULI staff, Lauren Callahan, Leah Shepard, and Jane Malici. The City of Norfolk, councilperson Andrea McClellan, city manager Chip Filer, Pete Burek, and many other city employees who gave and volunteered to participate and regularly support the Elizabeth River Trail. Support with much needed maps and GIS data came from Carl Larson, City of Norfolk, Peter Johnson with Work Program Architects, and Steve Lambert from Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization. A very special thanks to all the community stakeholders, city staff, business owners, and trail advocates who generously shared their time and insight with the panelists earlier this week. And finally, thanks to our ULI panelists, Fernando Costa, Ryan Bowman, Rachel Griffin, Paul Moyer, Rogelio Pardo, and panel advisor Caleb Stratton. Your time and collective expertise is invaluable, and we are eager to hear your recommendations. Thanks in advance for helping to determine the best practices for a strong and enduring Elizabeth River Trail. And now I'll turn it over to Fernando for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Fernando Costa, Assistant City Manager for the City of Fort Worth, Texas. And on behalf of the Urban Land Institute, I'd like to welcome you to our presentation about the Elizabeth River Trail in Norfolk, Virginia. Next slide, please. A word about the Urban Land Institute, or ULI. Our mission is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. We're a multidisciplinary membership organization with more than 45,000 members, both in the public and private sectors. We do a wide variety of things, but of particular relevance today, we conduct advisory service panels. Next slide, please. ULI has been conducting these panels since 1947. It has helped during that time more than 700 communities to find independent, strategic, and practical solutions for their most challenging land use issues. And since COVID, we've been conducting these panels virtually, and we expect that in the post-COVID era, the virtual model will continue to be an option for communities that request ULI's assistance. Next slide, please. And of course, we'd like to thank our sponsors, the Elizabeth River Trail Foundation and the JPB Foundation, which has generously funded this effort. All of the panelists are serving pro bono and are happy to do so as part of our membership in the Urban Land Institute. Next slide, please. We'd like to thank our valued stakeholders, some 50 or so individuals who gave us their time to provide insight into the various issues that we've been addressing in Norfolk this week. Next slide, please. And I'm honored to introduce our panelists. Besides myself, Ryan Bauma with the architectural engineering firm of AECOM in Washington, D.C., Rachel Griffith from the Chester County Planning Commission in Pennsylvania, Paul Moyer with the architectural engineering firm of Jacobs in Arlington, Virginia, Rogelio Pardo with Urban Movement Labs in Los Angeles, California, and not present today, but of assistance on a part-time basis, our technical advisor, Caleb Stratton, from Hoboken, New Jersey. Of course, we would not have been able to perform this work without the able assistance of ULI staff, including Lauren Callahan, Leah Shepard, and Luke Hamill. Next slide, please. And so our purpose this week has been principally to assess certain issues raised for our attention by the Elizabeth River Trail Foundation, cited throughout this presentation as the ERTF, and to provide the foundation with practical advice for resolving those issues. And among the various stakeholders that we've interviewed and with whom we've had extensive discussions this week are the foundation itself, board and staff, the city of Norfolk, elected officials, city manager, various department heads and staff, local businesses of different kinds, anchor institutions, of which there are several that are important to the Elizabeth River Trail, civic leagues, neighborhood organizations, and other groups throughout the community. Next slide, please. Our process involved a deep dive into the issues, listening carefully to diverse local perspectives, ultimately building consensus within the panel and producing a written report and the presentation that you'll be hearing in a moment. Next slide, please. The scope of today's presentation includes several elements. First, we'll begin with a brief analysis of existing conditions and trends, upon which we add a set of guiding themes that cut across our responses to the various questions posed to us by the foundation. We then go specifically into each of the 4 questions that the foundation has raised. They have to do with funding for operations and maintenance, coordination with the city, how the trail can contribute to coastal resilience strategy, and how we work to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and thereby advance economic development and neighborhood vitality in Norfolk. We present other recommendations that are of particular relevance to the foundation, and then we summarize some key next steps that we recommend for implementing our findings today. Next slide, please. And so we begin with the analysis of existing conditions and trends. We ask 3 basic questions. First, what attributes make the Elizabeth River Trail distinctive? And there are many, but we'd like to highlight 3 of them. First, that the trail provides wonderful access to a wide range of historic, cultural, and natural resources. Everything from downtown Norfolk to historic Fort Norfolk, the stadium, the university, Norfolk State and Old Dominion, the hospital complex, and others, great parks, cultural institutions. A second important attribute is the strong support that the trail enjoys from virtually everyone with whom we spoke. Users, public officials, civic leaders, businesses, institutions across the board. Everyone spoke well about the value of the trail and its great potential for the future. And third, we'd like to underscore the importance of the foundation's influential and active board, along with their small but resourceful staff. It's a great resource, and without it, the trail would not be what it is today. What challenges does the community seek to address? We've identified 3 in particular. The trail's physical condition, highlighting a need for better maintenance and safety-oriented improvements throughout its 10.5-mile path. Second, a memorandum of understanding between the city and the foundation, which was executed back in 2016. The stakeholders have found over time lacks sufficient specificity and clarity and needs to be addressed in that regard. And finally, but not least important by any means, a significant disparity between the socioeconomic characteristics of trail users and beneficiaries on the one hand, and the characteristics of Norfolk's general population on the other, calling to mind the importance of greater diversity in all of the trail-related activities. Next slide, please. The last question that we pose in respect to existing conditions and trends is what opportunities are available to maximize the trail's potential, and there are a whole host of them. The ones we'd like to highlight begin with broad support that we've found among city officials and business owners and many others for the possible creation of a business improvement district, or BID, by which the city might be able to raise revenues from beneficiaries of the trail to support operations and maintenance of that facility. A great deal of support for that idea, although it still requires further investigation. Another opportunity pertains to the city manager having designated a single city official authorized to solve problems and expedite projects in order to get things done efficiently and effectively. That's an important resource, and one that all stakeholders can use to get things done. We found a broad agreement, particularly between the city and the foundation, about the need to update the memorandum of understanding between those two parties. So the fundamental agreement already exists to update the MOU, particularly with the understanding that the city is responsible for maintaining the basic infrastructure along the trail, and the foundation is responsible for taking care of various discretionary amenities along the trail. The trail can address a wide variety of flooding issues, which are critical to Norfolk, not just in the future, but even today. And you'll be hearing momentarily about some opportunities to address those issues by use of the trail. And finally, we found a broad support for extending the trail eastward to serve various historically African-American neighborhoods. Further study is necessary to assign priority to those extensions, but a great deal of support already exists to get that done. Next slide, please. And so I'd like to touch on the three guiding themes. You'll see these themes reflected across all of our responses to the foundation's questions. First, the trail is much more than just a trail. It's a component of the city's transportation system. It's an element of Norfolk's flood control infrastructure. It's a tool for economic development in alignment with the Norfolk Innovation Corridor and a multitude of other economic development assets. And the trail is an amenity for neighborhood vitality and connectivity. So it's much more than just a bicycle and pedestrian facility. Another theme is that success depends upon strong partnerships, including the city and many others with whom we've interacted this week. And finally, the trail can be an important catalyst for diversity, equity, and inclusion, broadening the variety of users, adjacent neighborhoods, and even the composition of the foundation's board and committees. Next slide, please. I'm happy now to turn the platform over to my colleague, Rachel Griffith, who will address the first of the foundation's questions: what sustainable funding models are possible for trail operating and maintenance expenses? Rachel?
Thanks, Fernando, and good morning, everyone. So the question that's often at the top of young nonprofit organizations' mind is, how do we get sustainable operating funding? And the Elizabeth River Trail Foundation is no different. And they're at, from what we've heard from our stakeholder interviews, they're at sort of a critical juncture in their organizational life cycle where they've been doing a really great job identifying creative sources of operating revenue thus far, but are really looking for something sustainable moving forward. So their current challenge is that approximately $775,000 is needed per year for annual operating costs. And this breaks down to about $500,000 to maintain the trail, about $100,000 for any emergency trail repairs that may be needed, like due to flooding and things like that, and $175,000 to operate the foundation, which is mostly staff costs. So their current sources of operating revenue are primarily from individual donations. Also, they run a number of successful special events, which have the potential to raise even more revenue in non-pandemic years. And also the project administration allowances that can be received from the capital grants that they get for trail construction projects. And they have lots of other sources of revenue as well that are smaller amounts. And then there's also the city's contribution. The city, according to the MOU, is the designated maintainer of the trail. And our understanding is that in last year or this year's budget, there's about $10,000 budgeted to maintain the trail, which, as you see, falls significantly short of what's needed. So we've come up with a number of recommendations, and the way we're structuring them is that there's early action recommendations, medium term and long term, but that the early action items really are meant to help catalyze both the medium term and the long term, and that, you know, you can be working on both of them at the same time. Next slide, please. So for the early action items, we understand that the foundation is already in the process of initiating a Friends of the Elizabeth River Trail, or a membership program, to sort of solicit donations on a recurring basis from people who support the trail. And there's a couple different ways to structure a membership program like this. And one is with more of a focus on bringing on as many members as possible, and having low donation amounts from lots of different people. And one is really geared towards revenue generation that is for higher donation amounts, and you may have fewer donors. And so it seems like the trail has some plans for putting up maybe QR codes along the trail with a donate now kind of thing. So there's ways to get these small amounts of donations, whether it's through that or through crowdfunding or something. But we're recommending that this Friends of the Elizabeth River Trail targets larger donation amounts, at least $100, and that it's structured in a way that really has minimal administration costs for the foundation. So any perks associated with it might be associated with events that are already planned, rather than having special events just for these donors. And then another component of that could be sort of an in-kind donation of actual maintenance, where we understand that there is an Adopt a Spot program that the Keep Norfolk Beautiful program operates, and there could be an Adopt a Trail program that they operate, and a corporation or some college students could adopt part of the trail, and they're responsible for the maintenance of that piece of the trail. Maybe not repairing the asphalt, but picking up trash and maybe replanting things and things like that. The second early impact or early action recommendation is to commission an economic impact study. And we think this could be a valuable tool to show the stakeholders, the businesses and the city, that there's already an economic benefit that the trail is creating, and to really quantify what that is. And we think this could be a helpful tool when you're going out to businesses in solicitation of this business improvement district. And also to show the city what the economic impact is, and that if they spend money on improving the trail, that they will then get that back. So we'll talk about this in more detail a little later on in the presentation, but in order to really make the trail more inclusive and to get this broader user base and support base, we recommend doing a survey of potential trail users. And what I mean when I say potential trail users is people who are not currently using the trail, and really understanding what the barriers are to them using the trail. And once that is understood, then you can really start doing the work of addressing those barriers. And then the next thing is to do some feasibility work to determine if a bid is going to be possible, a business improvement district. And this should really be led by the city. And this would involve a lot of cultivation of the businesses, because you will need 30% of the businesses to sign on to an initial petition. So there will be some initial work that needs to be done. And then moving on to the medium-term recommendations, this is really the main recommendation is to establish a business improvement district. And we're recommending looking at the area within 1,000 feet of the trail. So this would capture the businesses and the apartments that really derive the most benefit from it because they're so close. So within this area, there's about $5 billion in assessed value from our back of the napkin analysis. So definitely more work would need to be done to confirm these numbers. But of that 5 billion, we think about 1.3 billion is commercial value that could be assessed as part of the business improvement district. And we're recommending the business improvement district and somewhere around the railroad line that kind of cuts through the city, because it really would be in the most concentrated area of commercial uses, because farther north, it's much more residential. Next slide, please. So within that district, there's a significant amount of institutional land use. So this is the color coding for these pie charts. And you see that for the assessed value, more than half of the assessed value is institutional uses. And this does not include the city's land. So it's everything but the city. And then in terms of acreage, it's also almost half. But there are significant amounts of commercial uses. And in terms of acreage, there's a lot of industrial, but in terms of assessed value, that's much less. But what that translates to, if you go to the next slide, is about, like I said, 1.3 billion in total assessed commercial value that could be applied towards the business improvement district. And these are just two potential millage rates that could be assessed to those commercial businesses. So these show that we think it's pretty possible to get to that $750,000 through the business improvement district model, if this were to be feasible. And I think it's just important to note that the downtown business improvement district that currently exists is 1.6 mils, or excuse me, 0.16. So 16 cents per $100. And so this is significantly less than that. So back to those institutional uses, like I said, 43% of the land area and 51% of the total assessed value is tax exempt. Yet these institutions are definitely benefiting from the trail. And we pulled out some of the major landowners within the area, the primary one being Centera Health, with by far the highest assessed value within the improvement district of 1.4 billion. And then the Commonwealth, which probably comprises some of Norfolk State University and also any other state universities, and then the Eastern Virginia Medical School at 325 million, and the US government. So some of the Navy establishments. So there could be a payment in lieu of taxes or pilot established with these organizations in order to bring in additional funds for operating and maintenance. Because like I said, these organizations are deriving value from the trail. Next slide, please. So I know we're talking about operating expenses and ways to bring in revenue for those, But it's also we're talking about capital improvements because we did hear from our stakeholder interviews that grant writing can be a full-time job for foundation staff, but they have so many other things that they're doing. So really determining who should be responsible for grant writing moving forward and developing a program around that. So is it a grant writing professional that the foundation contracts with, or is there a city staff person who could do the grant writing, or even a staff person at the MPO? So figuring out this piece of the puzzle sooner rather than later would be beneficial. And then going back to the idea that a trail is not just a trail, there's lots of different funding sources that this trail could be eligible for. And so just thinking broadly about what those might be, including resilience funds, transportation funds, environmental quality and brownfield remediation, and also public health and wellness, as well as public art. And then our long-term recommendation sort of ties in with the foundation's goal of making the trail more inclusive and more of an amenity for everybody in the city, is really part of the work of transforming it from this hidden gem that we heard so many people call it, to the local source of pride, which is part of the foundation's mission, and really something that everybody can rally around and support. And so once that transformation happens, and when I say transformation, I mean of people's attitudes towards the trail, then a potential voter referendum that would establish a dedicated annual operating fund for the trail's maintenance might be successful. We don't think it would be successful right now, but this is something to work towards, we think. And then for the second question, I will pass it off to my colleague, Rogelio Pardo.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll be chatting a little bit about coordination between the city and the foundation. So next slide, please. So we're very well aware, and it's been great to learn about how the foundation has just been critical to build support and excitement for the trail within the community. But to realize the potential of the trail, the city needs to play a big part in this by really leveraging their municipal authority. So we'll talk through a few strategies about how the foundation and the city can collaborate to make this happen. Next slide, please. So bringing dynamic projects like the vision for the river trail require collaboration with various partners and institutions, but also within different departments in the city. And sometimes that communication isn't very clear. Reinforcing a city champion or a champion within city staff is really critical to help direct staff and resources to implement efforts along the river trail. Additionally, this leadership position within the city can help foster data sharing and regular communication within agencies, which often isn't the case in many municipalities. And this data sharing is really important because it helps different departments know when they're working in an area and helps them coordinate construction and maintenance schedule. It's always frustrating when a new facility is developed only to be ripped up a few weeks later to do some underlying utility work. Additionally, the city plays a key role in being a converger of different stakeholders, of institutions, and continuing communications with the foundation, of course, to provide updates and help strategize on what the next priorities should be. And then lastly, this role is really needed to help validate the city's commitments in the memorandum of understanding that was signed between the city and the foundation. So next slide, please. So speaking of the MOU, what we heard is that though the MOU was signed back in 2016, a lack of specificity within that document has really created some challenges for the city, and they've been unable to execute on a specific scope because the document kind of lacks specificity. We've reviewed the MOU and have identified a few topics and potential recommendations for how the MOU can be bolstered to really provide a specific scope. On the topic of public safety, we really think that the role of enforcement of traffic safety, especially for areas that are on streets, and ensuring the facilities are safe really lie on the city's plate. On the topic of maintenance, which in the MOU falls solely on the plate of the city, we think a split might be appropriate, where the city really is focused on the public right-of-way, which includes the landscaping, the trail maintenance itself, make sure things are smooth. But when it comes to ancillary services such as restroom maintenance, or perhaps even water fountain maintenance, those are services that may be best contracted by the foundation to provide additional support. The MOU also highlights that the foundation should provide additional input for development projects along the river trail. However, it lacks specificity as to how this would happen beyond traditional community input processes. So I think it's a question to be asked. Is there a need to go beyond standard community input process? And if so, what does that look like? It very well may be an advanced notification or some sort of additional communication just to ensure that the foundation provides their formal written commentary. On the programming side, we know that the river trail is becoming a place that many institutions such as NSU are really looking to bring communities to and use it as a space to program events. The city may consider developing a streamlined permitting process that facilitates the adoption or approval of projects along the right-of-way of the trail. And they may even consider working with a foundation to have the foundation provide additional support, either in permit review or in sharing information with potential stakeholders that would like to host an event. And then lastly, we've heard that currently it's pretty challenging to free up funds to make any sort of improvement along the trail. So it's important to provide the administrative authority to the city to release funds and make either maintenance projects or other improvements along the river trail. Next slide, please. So while the MOU is really great at improving or continuing kind of the piecemeal approach of identifying improvements as they come along the trail, establishing a formal right-of-way designation would really give the city the authority to incorporate the trail into all its comprehensive planning documents, and would allow the city to kind of guide developments that come in along the trail. We're recommending that this detailed right-of-way is approved via city ordinance, which identifies both the specific route for the trail in its entirety and includes parcels within 1,000 feet in each direction of the trail itself. This inclusion of the parcels would allow for the city to outline regulations and leverage input for developments that happen within that designated public rail or public right-of-way. In addition to the inclusion of the trail within long-term planning documents in the city, it also provides justification for releasing resources to improve it, and also helps guide conversations with developers to require them to either include amenities such as lighting or maintaining the trail that is adjacent to their property, and also helps ensure that new development enhances the public space along the trail instead of creating some friction between the built environment and the beautiful trail facilities. Next slide. And lastly, continuing on this theme of an overarching comprehensive view of the plan or of the trail, a master plan would be a great resource that outlines the different priorities along the river, helps prioritize projects, and helps guide resources to make the vision, the complete vision for the river trail complete. This type of document often contains components such as design specifications, both for facilities and for construction along the river trail, may codify any land uses that are necessary or deemed appropriate by the community to ensure that there's a mix of developments and projects along the river, and also helps prioritize individual projects and identify funding strategies for making that happen. So a lot of what Rachel was mentioning could be codified in a master plan like this. And lastly, a master plan, which is led by the city in collaboration with the foundation, would really present an opportunity to build on the base that the foundation has built in recent years and co-create a community vision for what the river looks like in the future. And with that, I'll come up to the next slide, where I believe I'll pitch it over to Ryan to talk about how the trail can help really maintain some environmental resiliency in the community.
Thank you very much, Rogelio, and good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you. So you asked us to think about how the trail could be leveraged for coastal resilience and flood protection in either its current alignment or a new one, and how could it fit into Norfolk's other strategies and local investment to enhance resilience. And so let's move on to the next slide. I think when we looked at the context, we did see that the trail can help the city significantly, we think, in adapting to its changing climate. Can also help mitigate the extent of that change by supporting active mobility. Segments of the trail and their surrounding spaces work together, and they're well located to intercept rising river levels and capture rainfall in inland situations as well. Go to the next slide. So certainly Norfolk is vulnerable to a number of different coastal, riverine, and interior flooding situations. The Corps of Engineers helped identify those resources and challenges. In many respects, some of the things that they highlighted was the need for coastal resilience and flood barriers and things like that, in more or less a similar alignment to the way that the trail follows the riverfront, certainly south of Lambert's Point and moving eastward. And so what we thought was important there is that more than any other street or other piece of public right-of-way, the trail is best positioned to tie together a series of infrastructure changes to help meet the intent of these flood barriers, but also to provide and continue to provide great public access to and along the Elizabeth River. We move to the next slide. So we put together a quick diagram here with some ideas for you all to consider as really taking the next step in a conversation. A lot more analysis needs to be done to revise and refine these ideas, but we wanted to talk about the way in which the trail corridor and with extensions to it, different roles that it could play in a broader strategy for coastal resilience. I think, there's a few key things we want to talk about here. First, the idea of how segments of the trail, kind of highlighted here in blue, how they could function as a bridge, a corridor that connects people to critical destinations and services during flood events. In yellow, we highlighted places where we think those trail segments could function as an elevated shoreline. An embankment that helps keep floodwaters away from vulnerable property and infrastructure, but also creates great public open space amenities that are usable at all times of year and not just flood protection infrastructure. And in green, we've highlighted trail segments that we think could potentially function as sponges, places where the trail corridor could soak up either interior flood-related waters or help soften the wave action that comes with sea level rise and storm surge along the edge. And starting to think about some tributaries that lead to the trail and how they might be able to function as part of this broader system. This sort of builds on some of the ideas that you can see in Norfolk's coastal resilience strategy, where a number of locations were highlighted in needing either new berms or flood walls. What we want to think about is how the trail can provide that same function, but with other co-benefits that create recreation, health, and mobility opportunities for many neighborhoods throughout the city. We could go on to the next slide. So here are just some examples of what we're talking about when we mean how can the trail function as an elevated shoreline. This project from Richmond, British Columbia, actually, was done in order to elevate a landscape, and rather than simply have a typical levee that only provided flood protection, the embankments were created here to provide for mobility, active mobility, as well as terraced amphitheaters that were great gathering spaces for people. And it also involved educational opportunities and the opportunity to create new habitat while elevating that flood protection along the riverfront. Next slide. You can see these techniques used in other parts of Virginia, in Alexandria's waterfront. Recently, there was after the planning there were several new developments built that elevated their first floors so that the buildings themselves were outside of that flood threat. And then the new sea walls were created and new landscapes were terraced between those sea walls and the new development to create great waterfront public space that also acts as that elevated shoreline. This is the kind of ideas that could be possible around Harbor Park or in parts of Fort Norfolk. Next slide. So when we talk about the trail and its corridor acting as a sponge, we're looking at creating new wetland environments. And those wetland environments could happen in an interior location. And again, intercept and store, soak up and filter the runoff that happens there to avoid inland flooding issues. And those same kind of techniques can be integrated along the water's edge, along the shoreline to help buffer coastal storm surge and to help absorb some of those waters as well. Sometimes the sponge idea that can't replace a barrier that's necessary, but you can also use them in combination in many cases to provide that new elevated barrier with a living shoreline edge to help soak up the water and the energy that comes with it. We'll go to the next slide. So the bridge idea is something that can function in multiple ways. Some of our work in Philadelphia looked to create a new bicycle and pedestrian route that actually goes above the river in order to provide for crossings over key infrastructure and to provide a safe route for pedestrians, cyclists, and actually for emergency access during flood events. So that's one way the bridge idea can work. Another way is to have the trail be slightly elevated as it moves through along key streets in neighborhood areas like Edgewater or Larchmont moving farther north. You could imagine there have been discussions about potentially elevating portions of Hampton Boulevard, how a new alignment or a spur of the trail could be part of that elevation to where that corridor acts like a bridge, providing safe access through those neighborhoods to key destinations like the port or the hospital to the south during flood events. And the next slide, please. The entire corridor, though, we think has a great role to play as a storyteller. Again, it's a piece of infrastructure that ties together a great series of events and places, key destinations, and storylines about Norfolk's great maritime history, past, present, and future. And we think that it has the ability to also educate and raise awareness on sea level rise issues, coastal resilience issues, and what the city is doing to help adapt to those changes and mitigate the extent of those changes. So we don't want to underestimate the role of the trail as a storyteller and as a place that can demonstrate all of the great things that Norfolk is planning to do and implementing. And that means everything from public art installations to places where you can view and appreciate the water and its changing levels in different ways, and more direct interpretive educational signage and elements that help tell those stories as more and more people use the trail, both residents and visitors. Next slide. And lastly, as we move towards implementation, we think about, okay, how do we start to have the trail function more and more in this way as an integral piece of flood infrastructure? We want to think about a couple key points. Number one, we think one of the first things to do is to create a baseline assessment of the trail conditions today based on their adjacency and right-of-way widths, and then overlay the anticipated inundation vulnerability mapping that's been done at key years, and then overlay the topography that exists today. And that's going to be needed to determine how much the trail could be elevated or would need to be elevated in key locations to help provide that barrier. And so that's the next level of detail needed to help reinforce that strategy. We want to make sure to be clear, though, with the city and the Corps of Engineers and the broader community that the trail is in a critical location for flood risk reduction and that it can play a significant role and needs to be invested in order to do it. We want to focus those investments first where there's a combination of the highest benefit, the highest visibility, and the lowest cost so that we can move quickly to prove the resilience value to residents and decision makers. Keep those projects initially quite simple with an emphasis on new and expanded trail connectivity. There's a lot that can be done, but the first benefit of the trail is being contiguous and connected. So we want to make sure that those early projects help reinforce that. And lastly, we want to bundle the issues and look for critical intersections where several challenges can be addressed simultaneously by one project so that when those investments are made, we get many co-benefits out of that same investment. Thank you very much. I'm now going to pass it to Paul Moyer to speak more about how the trail can become a diverse, equitable, and inclusive community asset.
Thank you, Ryan. So the last question, as mentioned, is what we'll call DEI. So when you hear me say that, that's diverse, equitable, inclusive. So if you go to the next slide, please. As the panel began discussing the idea of DEI and the trail and how it could be a catalyst for DEI, we came across the fact that the city is a leader in the region and has launched its own DEI initiative, as noted here on the right. And we thought that this was a great way to kind of think of our efforts related to DEI and the trail and how the trail can become a contributor to this larger citywide and ultimately region-wide DEI focus. Next slide, please. So as we were thinking specifically about actions that we could take, the most direct one we came to was establishing a committee on the board, the ERTF board, that's focused on DEI. So it really becomes a focused effort. So that would have committee members and a committee chair. And the idea is that this, as part of this and maybe establishing this committee, we would look to expand those that participate on the board to some of the communities of color that may be less represented in the trail today. And as part of that committee, moving forward, we would recommend they develop some goals and objectives for how they will support the DEI initiative and really kind of help be a lens to make sure activities and energies that are being put into the trail reflect those initiatives and that flavor of thinking as we move forward. Next slide. So you've seen, you all probably know the trail. The trail goes through many neighborhoods in the city. We heard pretty clearly as we were going through our stakeholder interviews that there is a sort of a sense that the trail represents primarily the more affluent and white neighborhoods of Norfolk. And that was something, you know, that we wanted to think about relative to DEI. So if you go to the next slide, we were thinking about it, and Ryan kind of has talked, several people have talked about what connections should happen in the future. And really the point here isn't to say these are the exact connections that might happen in the future. We were just saying, you know, thinking forward, how can the trail connect to these nearby neighborhoods and really help bring them into the discussion and activities related to the trail. So as part of doing that, though, this is really needs to be, I'll say, community driven and be part of a larger discussion. So if you go to the next slide, one of and you've heard about this from others, the idea of a survey is something we think is important. And really, as mentioned previously, that survey should be, we'll say, potential future trail users, or really maybe a citywide survey to gauge interest in communities' interest in enhanced trail access as a way to begin to learn which areas make the most sense to connect to, where there might be the most interest. So as part of that, I do want to note Norfolk State University, which is at the at the far east end, which is connected, although it's not a great connection. So one of the ideas, and it was brought up during some of the stakeholder meetings, was to strengthen that connection to Norfolk State, which really would help emphasize the importance of DEI as part of the trail. And then also, as once we have survey information, begin to look at which neighborhoods connections make sense, or where there's the most interest, as well as physical connection, and start to build relationships with those communities to develop that buy-in and interest in the trail. Next slide. Two other, I'll say, events and programming ideas. The trail and the foundation do a tremendous job already of programming along the trail. And really, these are just some additional thoughts on how to expand that. The first one is there's already a strong relationship with Centerra. They're a big donor to the trail. And as we understand, they actually are actively supporting some programs along the trail where they match health professionals with the community to do walks and discuss health benefits of walking and biking and other exercise. We just think that could be also expanded to other communities of color that may not be as close to Centerra specifically. And then the second item here is the 10-minute walk, improving access to parks and green space. This is a national program that gets mayors and cities to sign on to, with the idea that those cities are looking to ensure 100% access within 10 minutes to a safe access to a quality park. And the city of Norfolk has not signed on to that, so we think that might be something good to do. And really, the point here is the trail is obviously a key connector in the city and could help achieve that goal for the city. Next slide, please. Another program that's actually here in Northern Virginia and Arlington, Virginia, where I'm located, is called Phoenix Bikes. Phoenix Bikes is a program and actually a physical facility. They support, they train and teach younger riders, 12 to 17-year-olds, how to fix bikes. And as part of that, they have an opportunity to earn a bike as part of their training. And then the bikes that get fixed are then sold as part of their facility where they sell refurbished bikes. So we think that's a great program. And sort of parallel to that is just the concept of a bike mentorship program, really just establishing connections from more experienced bikers with less experienced bikers, particularly again in communities of color. And then lastly, just as the DEI committee is helping to continue to look for ways to have events and activities in those communities of color. Next slide. And then partnerships. We've talked about partnerships in different ways. This particular concept is really how, thinking again from a DEI lens, how to partner with organizations such as houses of worship, where you might be able to connect with the communities of color. There may be ongoing programs or ways to leverage things that they're already doing, their membership. Again, really with the idea to encourage engagement in the trail, interest in the trail, and grow that base as we've talked about. And then obviously local schools, similar kind of perspective. There are opportunities to connect with younger bikers. We know there's universities along the trail. So similarly, making sure we are partnering with those universities to build that connection. And then minority-owned businesses along the trail, again, looking at ideas and opportunities to locate the businesses or encourage businesses to be located along the trail or see the benefit of the trail in maybe those communities of color. And then as we've mentioned, the Norfolk Innovation Corridor, which is a fairly new concept that also supports businesses located in the region. So the two could be mutually beneficial to encourage economic development. And then just continuing to collaborate with the Downtown BID and Downtown Norfolk Council and others. With that, I am going to turn it over to one of the other presenters, to Rachel. Thank you. Sorry.
That's quite all right. So we had just a couple other recommendations we wanted to share with you that didn't really fit neatly within any of the 4 questions. So you can go to the next slide, please. So firstly, it kind of struck us in our conversations with stakeholders, firstly, just how positive people already were about the trail. And we didn't really hear this need to create the iconic trail that is referenced in the foundation's vision. And so we understand that the foundation will be updating their strategic plan in the near future. And we encourage you to take a look at the vision and the mission and think about, if we're trying to be inclusive of everyone, and also if we're trying to really capture the Norfolk experience, which seems to be what the strongest part of the trail is, that it takes you to all these really interesting industrial places that are really unique to Norfolk. That perhaps that should be more reflected in the mission and vision. And if that becomes the case, there may be a different emphasis on what types of improvement projects get done on the trail in the future. Next slide, please. And then so for this one, I'll turn it over to Rogelio to explain.
As has been mentioned a few times, there's this perception that the trail users may be primarily from the wealthier communities within the city. And this is a perception that really needs to be shifted, not only to create a more inclusive vision for the trail, but also to ensure that it's possible to develop the political will and support necessary to make this grand vision possible. And the way to really make this happen is by leading with listening, right? And understanding and working with community members to understand not just what the opportunities are for the trail, but also to understand what the specific desires and potential concerns for some communities may be. We've seen it in many other communities where there are challenges with potential displacement, frictions between displacement and new development. So understanding what those concerns may be and being proactive about addressing them with policy solutions would be a great way of doing that. While it's certain that such an approach of listening and asking questions about how the trail can improve conditions for specific communities would make sense for a master planning process, these kinds of questions and solutions could also be slotted into the foundation's ongoing strategic planning work and their DEI initiatives to bolster those strategies and help engage with broader community members. And with that, I'll pitch it over to Fernando to take us home.
Thank you, Rogelio. During the last hour, we've flooded you with many different findings and recommendations to improve the Elizabeth River Trail. Of course, they're not all equally important, and you can't implement all of them at once. So we'd like to close today's presentation by summarizing some next steps that we think are most critical for the community to pursue. And so in year one, in the next 12 months, we recommend that the foundation proceed to update its strategic plan and to use this ULI report as a guide for that strategic planning process. We believe that the time is right for the city, in partnership with the foundation and other interested parties, to conduct a feasibility study on creation of the proposed business improvement district. We think it's also time to update the memorandum of understanding, and a fundamental consensus already exists that that idea makes sense. It's also desirable in the next year to prepare and adopt the trail ordinance that Rogelio described earlier in our presentation. And as Ryan described, to prepare an assessment of how the trail could contribute to the city's overall coastal resilience strategy. As Paul has described, the foundation should proceed in a timely way to establish a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, reaching out beyond the current board membership to include civic leaders who have an interest in the trail, whether they've been involved in foundation activities in the past or not. And finally, as Rogelio has described, to formulate and adopt a long-range master plan for the trail and its future. Next slide, please. Moving ahead, in subsequent years, the city should be able to create the business improvement district and to begin receiving substantial revenues to fund the operation and maintenance of the trail. And also within the next 2 or 3 years, the city and the foundation should be able to extend the trail strategically into high priority underserved neighborhoods so as to expand the population that benefits from the trail. And in the long run, probably year 5 and beyond, to extend the trail to Naval Station Norfolk to the north and Virginia Beach and other communities to the east, eventually linking to the Southampton Roads Trail, the Birthplace of America Trail, and even the East Coast Greenway, which runs along the whole eastern seaboard of the United States. The Elizabeth River Trail is an extraordinary asset for the city of Norfolk, providing a wide variety of public benefits. The trail's future is even brighter as the foundation and the city explore opportunities to leverage this asset for multiple purposes while expanding and diversifying the population that it serves. We encourage the foundation and all of its partners, therefore, to continue their good work and enable the trail to achieve its full potential. Next slide, please. It's time now for questions and answers. And we will check the question box. And we have a question. Any thoughts on how to approach a potential bid where one already exists in the downtown corridor of the Elizabeth River Trail? Rachel, you want to tackle this question?
I think that remains to be determined. There's actually a very small amount of overlap between the existing downtown bid and the one that we're proposing. So, you know, potentially those businesses that are already part of that bid could be excluded, or my understanding is that that bid is going to expire in 2026, so there'd only be a couple years of overlap. So if there is overlap permitted, it might only be for a couple years, or those businesses could be included at a later date.
Good thoughts, Rachel. Thank you. Any other questions?
Fernando?
Kevin, yes, sir.
Yes, I've got one. And the first one is how many times I'm going to have to watch this video to absorb all the information the panelists have presented. It's been overwhelming in a positive way. Thank you very much. The question that I have, and I think I know the answer, but I want to hear it articulated by the experts. It is both mentioned that the trail is not fully built out, that we have work to do to improve, to make a continuous connected trail. But we also think it's very important to extend the trail, to improve it, and to address the diversity, equity, inclusion shortcomings. which is first? Where, we can't, it's going to be difficult for us to take on expanding the trail and completing the build out at the same time. Do we need to do that, or is one more important than the other?
That is a great chicken and egg question, Kevin. And we actually spent a fair amount of time talking about it. Ryan,
Yeah,
give it a shot.
sure. I think Kevin, you've picked a great topic to discuss, especially when you think about what to do next. And I think where our group got to was that you've already done a great job of identifying particular pain points along the existing trail that need enhancement, improvement, capital dollars spent on them. And so we would encourage that that you continue to look at those points where you can really connect the trail you have, and that's where the capital dollars and the implementation attention should be spent. However, at the same time, in order to think about extending the trail, there needs to be a bit of a planning process for that, one that's inclusive and neighborhood based. And so what we would say is it is a bit of doing both at the same time, focusing on the capital spend on the pain points and the low hanging fruit along the trail you have, while focusing on the planning process and the engagement with those surrounding communities needed to figure out where the best extensions or the optimal extensions should be. And in the meantime, the funding source questions potentially can begin to be resolved so that in the future, there's enough dollars to do more of those simultaneously. Hopefully that's a concise enough answer to your question, but feel free.
It is. I look forward to going back and watching it again. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ryan. You really need to have broader community support to achieve the trail's purposes. And to do that, you really need to extend the trail and serve more neighborhoods. And that way, you'll be able to generate the resources to make the necessary repairs to the existing portion of the trail. That sounds a little counterintuitive, but it needs to happen. So, Ryan, thank you for that great response. We've got several other questions. Did you all review the city's bicycle and pedestrian strategic plan to see how that plan connects other parts of the city to the Elizabeth River Trail? Let's see, Paul, do you want to tackle that one?
Well, and Ryan probably looked at it more closely than I did, but yes, we did look at that. And I think some of those dashed connections are coincident with what's in the bicycle pedestrian strategic plan. So yes, we looked at it. We think the two, I mean, one of the things I'll say from my perspective, as we talked about extending the trail, is, are we extending the trail or connecting to it? Some of those other connections may not be part of the trail proper, but they are important to ultimately connect to those neighborhoods. And that's, again, part of that master planning discussion that needs to happen, to think about, are they part of the street system, part of just the regular connectivity, or part of the trail specifically?
Thanks, Paul. Ryan, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think when we had our stakeholder engagement earlier in the week, there was some good almost debate about whether the Elizabeth River Trail should be extended or create loops with it, or whether it's really other parts of the bicycle and pedestrian network connect to it. And there were pros and cons on both sides. So I think what we were trying to put forward here was the idea of tributaries. The river itself has tributaries like Ohio Creek and other things that lead to it. And perhaps the Elizabeth River Trail has tributaries as well that connect more inland communities to it. Again, those are hypotheses to be tested and refined by that planning process. So lots of good ways of connecting the bike ped planning work that's been done to the future aspirations of the trail.
And I'll just add to that that the planning process will also determine who would ultimately be responsible for those tributaries. If they're a part of the trail, maybe it's the foundation, but if they're more a part of the street network, then it would probably be the city.
Good point of clarification, Rachel. We've got several other questions. The next one may be more of a comment than a question, but we might want to respond. It comes from someone named Rachel, and it's directed to someone named Rachel. And it says the downtown bid does have a 7-year sunset clause, but it is highly unlikely that it would not be renewed. That is to say that it will be renewed in all likelihood. The property owners overwhelmingly support the bid. That certainly bodes well for support of a bid that would assist the Elizabeth River Trail. Kevin, you want to, I'm sorry, Rachel, do you want to comment?
Well, I'm glad to hear that they're overwhelmingly supportive of it. Yeah, so if the bid is never going to expire, it'd have to be determined whether the overlap in businesses that would be in both bids would want to be in both bids, or could they be in both bids, or would they have to be excluded from the trail bid?
It would make sense for them to benefit from both sets of services. Thank you, Rachel. We have another question. How will civic leagues and neighborhood organizations be partnered with to identify what expanding the trail looks like in these neighborhoods not currently served by the Elizabeth River Trail? I think that might be, well, anyone could take the question. Who'd like to respond?
I'm happy to take a crack at it.
Yes, Rogelio.
Yeah, so I think, civic leagues and neighborhood organizations, from what we heard, have been engaged with, and the foundation has gone and shared their preliminary ideas. The next steps, though, really have to go beyond sharing the opportunities of the trail and becoming collaborative partners with civic leagues, and maybe more so with neighborhood-based organizations. In my experience, civic leagues or neighborhood councils aren't always representative of community members. So that's just some homework that the foundation and the city will have to do to determine who's representing this specific league, and is that representative of this community? And if not, what other organizations or community partners are there? One strategy that has been used in the past is identifying community ambassadors, right? So these are trusted individuals within a specific neighborhood that can really facilitate communication between the foundation and the city's goals for the trail and the community, to really kind of open up a dialogue through a trusted voice that helps, direct conversations to be productive in a way that facilitates the listening aspect rather than the telling aspect of what the foundation and city have done so far. Ryan, is there something you'd like to add to that?
Thank you so much. I think the next question builds on what Rogelio was just discussing, and it relates well to some of the points that Paul was making earlier. So let me pose the question. Past online surveys have proven to be limited in their reach demographically, skewing to existing trail user demographics and not capturing lower income persons of color, community members, or non-current trail users. What kind of community engagement techniques can be utilized with limited staff and resources to reach these communities more effectively? Great question. I know several of us can respond, but let me give Paul the first crack at it.
I was going to say, I know all of us struggle with this in different communities, but I think the first concept is you need to go to those, you can't, I agree, you can't just expect people to respond to an online survey. You're going to need to go to those communities and have a way to meet them where they are physically and get them engaged in a discussion, in actually filling out a survey live right there, those kinds of things. So that's a little more labor intensive, but maybe there's an opportunity to work with ODU or some other university to help implement some strategies like that.
And I'll just say that I worked on a similar project. In Philadelphia, we have the Circuit Trails, which is our regional trail network that sort of starts in Philadelphia and webs out from there. And we contracted with a research firm to do a number of different methods to basically find out what people thought about the trail. So we did intercept surveys, which the foundation already did, but that's already who's using the trail. But then we also did like a random sample survey that was sent out electronically and mailed to random addresses within the area. And then there's also like these research firms at probably universities have lists of people who have signed up to take surveys, and they get paid a little bit of money to do it. And so this is also kind of a random sampling to find out what they think. So there's different methods, but if you're able to hire a researcher, I think that would probably be very helpful.
Let me call on Rogelio in just a moment. But Rogelio, you might want to tackle the next question as well. What are some of the marketing and educational tools that will be utilized to inform and educate those communities that aren't currently accessing the trail or aren't familiar with the benefits of a trail?
Thanks, Fernando. So first, to wrap up the survey question, I think in addition to what's already been shared, partnering with community-based organizations or with the Civic League is another way of getting surveys out there. And also just thinking about spaces where community members are. So some of my most successful community engagement efforts have included us going and standing in front of a community grocery store, going on the bus, going to Little League games, setting up a tent at the farmer's market and just having conversations with people, asking them what it is that they like, what it is that their vision is. So just identifying or even local churches, right? So figuring out who are the trusted entities within a community and going to them and working with them in collaboration is really powerful. In terms of marketing and educational tools, I don't know that educational tools are really what is necessary, right? What is needed is maybe marketing, but I would maybe say more programming and more strategizing to figure out what is it that other communities need to feel welcomed in this community, right? So that might be programming that is targeted to specific neighborhoods or partnering with community-based organizations from neighborhoods that don't have a lot of users of the trail, so they can come out and experience it and feel welcome. And then also, they need to feel a sense of ownership. So I think it really goes back to what is the planning process for this? How do we ensure that during a master planning process or during the development of an ordinance, we're going out to the communities and getting feedback and incorporating what their vision and their concerns are into the overall plan of the trail. So to get people involved, we need to do some listening and incorporate their ideas so they see themselves reflected in the plan and in the trail as well.
Thank you, Rogelio. We have a question, and I think Ryan may want to comment if I can find it in the box. Is your recommendation regarding use of an elevated shoreline, et cetera, in lieu of the current Army Corps of Engineers plan that envisions physical barriers? Ryan?
No, it's not in lieu of it. Part of what we're suggesting is that we consider them the same thing, that if you're elevating the shoreline, you're creating the physical barrier, but you can do that by building a wall, but but walls have a tendency to keep people from the water and they might interrupt views and that sort of thing. Or you could do it by elevating the landscape, elevating shoreline to act like a wall, but to also provide all the great mobility and gathering amenities and that sort of thing that you enjoy today. So it's taking the Corps of Engineers research and saying and definition of where that wall needs to go and what scale it would need to be at, but then potentially meeting that function using a change in the landscape. That's less of a wall, more of a elevated piece of parkland or edge of a street, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Ryan. Great response. The next question, a trail ordinance is much needed, but that also will take a city staff champion. Curious which recommendation would take priority. One can't really happen without the other. I think the good news here is that you already have a city official designated by the city manager to serve as the staff champion, working in collaboration with multiple departments. We have the Parks Department, we have Public Works, Transit, Planning, General Services, other departments that are involved in trail-related activities. But this official, the Civic Lab Norfolk director has the full authority of the city manager to coordinate the work of these multiple departments to resolve problems and to expedite projects. So yes, they can both happen at the same time because you have that staff champion already. The next question, are statistics and numbers kept to define utilization of the trail? Recreators versus those that utilize the trail for employment. And what are the key hours of utilization? Who'd like to tackle that question? There was a survey done just before.
I think that might be me.
That'd be perfect.
Yeah, we've only been able to do one trail user survey that was quite truncated due to COVID, but we partnered with ODU and we did about a week and a half, almost 2 weeks of on trail interception of current users. But then that survey shifted online. So it was kind of not the best sample of everyone. And we do have some percentage numbers that the top 4 uses of the trail did include, walking and running, jogging, biking for commuting. And then we do have some information about the time of day, but that is definitely, I think, as we talked about a number of the opportunities for surveying, that some of those baseline use metrics need to be included.
We don't have enough data to draw the kinds of conclusions that we want. We have a good start, but unfortunately COVID got in the way and we need to resume those efforts. Thank you, Cheryl. I've got a couple more questions. Was there a consensus among the stakeholders that the south side, that is Berkeley, Compostela, et cetera, area of the city can be linked to the trail? And what proportion of stakeholders place emphasis on this idea? Let's see, who'd like to respond?
Well,
Ryan?
I'll take an early shot at that. I think at least in some of the stakeholder engagement meetings that we had, the idea of connecting across the river to Berkeley came up at least 2 or 3 times in the ones that I was part of. And there are, the Berkeley Bridge, there's certain types of amenities along it already that might be able to be leveraged to do that. How you make that connection is, of course, an infrastructure challenge. But the idea to connect across the river did come up multiple times. So I think your question was there consensus? I think the group was interested in making sure that the trail had good connectivity to as many Norfolk neighborhoods as possible. Of course, with the caveat that the planning process is necessary to really determine where the priorities are. So while it may be difficult to connect across the river, that idea did come up from stakeholders multiple times.
Great answer, Ryan. I think we're running short on time. I'm getting the signal that it's time for us to wrap things up. There is a comment. There is a pedestrian bridge crossing on the Berkeley Bridge going from the stadium parking area. So that's a good sign about the feasibility of that connection. I hope that we've generated increased interest in the Elizabeth River Trail. I think this discussion certainly underscores the degree of support for the trail and opportunities to improve it. And we appreciate this discussion. Let me ask Kevin if he'd like to make any closing remarks.
Just a big thank you from the foundation and the city of Norfolk. Really appreciate this work, and we promise to use it as we move forward with our strategic plan.
I would also really like to thank ULI staff, Lauren, Leah, Luke, even Jane, one of our local ULI reps, that really helped connect us with this organization and start this process. We're really grateful for the work that your organization does, and we really look forward to implementing some of your recommendations.
Good luck.